Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I appreciate your patience as we have a brief delay. I'm Sarah Taveras. I'm the Engagement and Communications Manager for Welcome Home Westchester, and it is my privilege to stand in and facilitate today's panel on behalf of Jan Fisher, who had an emergency and was unable to join us this afternoon. The Welcome Home Westchester campaign, for those unfamiliar, is a multi-stakeholder effort consisting of business and nonprofit leaders, home builders, advocates, and faith leaders working together to drive a public conversation around fixing the housing shortage in Westchester County. We work to shine a spotlight on the everyday barriers to providing the housing we need through education and advocacy efforts, and to encourage our communities to make different, better choices. We believe that doing so will secure a Westchester that is welcoming to all who wish to live and work here. The 2026 modernization of SEQRA is a major step forward to removing these types of barriers to building the housing we need in Westchester while maintaining very important environmental protections and local zoning authority. Before I introduce today's panel, we invite you to submit your questions in the Q&A function through Zoom, and we will leave time at the end for a Q&A with our panelists where we will try our best to get to everyone's questions. We are very fortunate today to have three experts to discuss what the state's SEQRA reforms entail and how it will affect building proposals locally. It is my pleasure to introduce first Tim Foley, CEO and Executive Vice President of the Building and Realty Institute of the Hudson Valley, Kirsten Blad, Policy Manager for Open New York, and Josh Berman, Campaigns Manager, Regional Planning Association. We are going to start today's panel with a quick contextual presentation about SEQRA, and then we'll get into some questions before we head over to the Q&A. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim Foley, who's going to get us started with some history of SEQRA in Westchester.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And first and foremost, I want to thank all of our partners here within the Welcome Home Westchester campaign, especially RPA, who's been leading the effort on this particular webinar, and our good friends and allies at Open New York as well. So I have a very brief presentation to try and set the scene in terms of what these reforms were and what they mean specifically within the context of proposals that actually already have been built or are in the process of being built within Westchester County to literally concretize it in terms of what we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve. Before I do that, because we have any number of folks who are on the webinar of different levels of exposure to how housing gets approved in the 43 to 45, depending on how you count, municipalities within Westchester County, let alone across the state. I just want to say that there are any number of steps in that process. Usually someone has some land, they have an idea as to what they want to build there, they have to go to the local city, town, or village, and then they may go through any number of boards. They might go through a zoning board if it doesn't, what they have in mind doesn't exactly comport with the zoning that is already in that space. They may go to the planning board if there are special concerns that the planning board needs to review. They may go to the Board of Architectural Review if the municipality has that, so on and so forth. The piece that these reforms are really talking about relate to what's called SEQRA, the State Environmental Quality Review Act. And that doesn't just apply to housing. What that applies to is nearly all government actions, particularly local government at the local level within the municipal, city, town, or village, where anything that may have a potential environmental impact has to at least be reviewed to see if it does. And if it does, if it can be ameliorated and what that plan is. So that's really what we're talking about with these reforms, just the environmental review, which could be part of a much longer process in terms of getting housing approved in Westchester and again throughout New York State. But part of the problems that have accrued throughout the years is there's nothing necessarily inherently bad about looking at the potential environmental impacts. And for some proposals, that is absolutely essential to make sure that anything is correctly cataloged and, if possible, ameliorated. But one of the things that we found was for many of the typical multifamily housing projects, there were small to medium size. There were the most commonly being built within Westchester and other communities. We were going through SEQRA and not particularly finding anything. So let me give you some examples of what that looks like. Can we load up the presentation? So the following represents a couple of projects that have happened throughout the years. These were projects that were all ultimately approved, and they either were built or in the process of being built. They were all small to medium size. They are overwhelmingly what are called infill projects, meaning they're not being built on green land, they're not being built on undeveloped land. They're being built on land where there is something already, either a building or a parking lot or something else where it has been built out and we want to turn it into housing. All of them went through SEQRA, and all of them at the end of it were given what's called a negative declaration in SEQRA, which basically means no environmental impacts were found that needed to be ameliorated through a much more thorough process. Let's go to the next slide. The first example we have is the Saw Pit Senior Apartments in Portchester. This was an underutilized auxiliary parking lot. It was built into a modern four-story community featuring 34 affordable rental units, including 31 one-bedrooms and 3 two-bedroom units. As you can see, each of them have a balcony. They're quite nice. And this is specifically senior housing, meaning in order to live there, you have to be age 62 or older. 6 units are mobility accessible. 2 are designed for sensory hearing impairments. This is a huge need that we have throughout. Better options at more affordable prices for our seniors who want to stay in the communities that they live in. This went through a SEQRA process. It took many months. It is an existing parking lot. They found that there was no particular environmental review further that was necessary as a result of that process. So no harm, no foul, except it made the construction of this much longer in terms of its general process. By the way, we happen to think that this building is such a great example of the type of housing that we need in communities all throughout Westchester. Next slide. That we actually stood in front of it when we launched the Welcome Home Westchester campaign back in 2021. That's how much we like this place. Next slide. Our next example is a totally different type of housing. This wasn't on a parking lot. This was 100 Pondfield Road, which was in an unused 2 to 3 story warehouse that is close proximity, walking distance practically across the street from the Bronxville Metro North train station. This was not built affordable. This is actually luxury condominiums that were built. This was 11 units on the top 2 floors with parking on the first floor. This also went through SEQRA. This had a very long gestation period. It took almost 7 years. And in fact, it took so long that ownership of the property changed hands 3 separate times over the course of the application. The SEQRA itself wasn't all of that 7 years, but it was more than a year, at the end of which, again, they got the negative declaration. There was not environmental impact that they needed to ameliorate, but that still added an extra year onto the development of this. And this is open today, and as you can see from the interior, these apartments turned out beautiful. Next slide. This is one that is currently in production right now. In Croton-on-Hudson, there is a village-owned auxiliary parking lot, which is near the Croton-Harmon train station. Croton-Harmon has its own ginormous parking lot, which has not been at capacity post-COVID, even though quite a lot of people use that train station. This was an auxiliary parking lot, so even less of it was being used. The intent was to build a 5-story building with approximately 55 units on the parking lot site. And there would actually also be a privately owned parcel on 1 Croton Point Ave, which would be merged with the parking lot to create the site with a total of 100 apartments, as well as a public pocket park. You can see that's the green space right on it. A substantial portion of what is at this point just straight up asphalt macadam pavement would be turned into green space as well as housing. And this would be not just affordable housing, this would be affordable home ownership, because these would be affordable condos, fulfilling a particular need within our communities. This was something where it was village-owned parking lot. The village actually put out the proposal for it. The village was a strong supporter of getting this done, but it went through SEQRA. And SEQRA went 5 months for something that was desperately needed, and we kind of already knew what the answer was going to be because you're turning a parking lot into green space that's obviously going to, in fact, have a positive environmental impact, let alone a negative one. Next slide. This is still a different type of infill housing. This is 99 Church Street within White Plains. This again is an artist rendering because the construction is ongoing right now. This used to be Berkeley College. It is right in the heart of downtown White Plains. It is also going to be turned into affordable home ownership, into affordable condominiums. It is going to be fully electric. It is built to energy efficient standards. It's going to be 68 spacious 1, 2, and 3 bedroom homes. And I cannot stress this enough. There is a building that is already there. And so therefore, most of the impacts with regard to parking and with regard to traffic, so on and so forth, are not particularly different. This also went through SEQRA. This also wound up with a negative declaration at the end of it. So again, the pattern that you're seeing time and time and time again is there are many factors that go into the approval of housing. This is one where for certain small and mid sizes where it's being built on things where things already exist, at the end of that process, they're not finding anything to begin with. So all we're doing is delaying the building of much needed housing. Next slide. So there's a second part of it that Kirsten will talk about with regard to our reforms, which is not just about infill projects, but relates to all different types of housing in terms of actually creating some type of a shot clock. So there's a limitation on how long SEQRA can go for. And we have one unfortunate representative horror story about how long this process can go. There are guidelines within the SEQRA handbook about how long this environmental review process is supposed to take. No one particularly adheres to those timelines. And then we have some true outliers that delay very, very much needed and important projects. Next slide. So the textbook of this is Chappaqua Crossing in Chappaqua. I chose this picture specifically because you can see how gorgeous the interior is, but they did something clever. They actually showed you the outside of the building. That's that building that's on that big screen in the corner. So you're seeing inside and outside all at the same time. This is adaptive reuse. This used to be the former Reader's Digest Pleasantville campus. And this piece of it specifically was built in such a way that it preserved that landmark cupola from the Reader's Digest building. And it got turned into 64 mixed income residential units of workforce family housing and it was targeted for households earning at or below 40%, 60%, and 90% of the area median income. So quite a lot of different levels of affordability within it. When this was done, it was incredibly popular. Everybody came to the ribbon cutting. They saluted what a great building this was, particularly and how it fit in well with the rest of the Chappaqua Crossing. But getting it done was quite an ordeal. The secret process on this alone took approximately 15 years and required 2 lawsuits for a building that at the end of the day was exactly what we say we need, more affordable housing, and was something that everybody loved. And that's the problem in a nutshell that the governor was trying to solve and the legislature now has solved with what got passed in the budget. Next slide. So before I turn things over to Kirsten to explain what those reforms are, here's a quick highlighting of some misconceptions of projects in Westchester that would not benefit from the SEQRA exemption. As she will explain, it's very limited and it's targeted certain types of housing. And there's a bunch of projects that would not apply. Let's give some examples. Next slide. So it does not apply to large projects. As you'll hear, there's actually a unit count above which the SEQRA exemption does not apply. So there was an article in the Journal News when the debate was raging in Albany about why would you step aside from an environmental review of a massive project like the Galleria, which would be 3,000 units, or something like 143, 151 Woodsworth Avenue in Yonkers, where they're proposing approximately 700 units. And the answer is you wouldn't. SEQRA will still apply for those projects and things of comparable size. What we're really looking at is infill and adaptive reuse that is of a small to medium size, and there are other conditions that Kirsten will talk about that need to apply for the exemption. Next slide. It does not specifically affect single-family zoning. It actually doesn't affect zoning hardly at all. Essentially, this is just on the environmental review piece of it. So if a developer is coming in and they say, I bought all of these single family houses and I would like to turn it into one giant apartment building and is not zoned for it, the municipality has exactly the same number of tools at its disposal to say no or to negotiate it or to really to do whatever it wants aside from SEQRA. This is just talking about the environmental review piece of it. Local zoning remains in place. Next slide. And this was a particularly odd one. The whole intent about doing all of this was we wanted to build where stuff is already built because we're really confident that there aren't going to be environmental impacts at the end of it. And essentially, we're just delaying without necessarily a better outcome. There was a lot of concern that somehow we'd be talking about previously undisturbed land or environmentally sensitive areas, and we are quite explicitly not. So I just want to point this out there. This green field, the whole point is to save it and to build the housing, make it easier to build the housing where structures already exist. So that's the end of my presentation. And without further ado, I want to turn it over to Kirsten from Open New York to explain what these reforms are actually supposed to be doing. Kirsten?
Hi, I'm Kirsten Blod. I'm policy manager at Open New York. And yeah. So as Tim said, the reforms that were passed in the budget apply just to what we call infill housing. So this is housing on sites that has already been developed for another use. Next slide. So the way that the law determines whether something is infill housing is if it's on a previously disturbed site. And I'll be talking about that definition a little later. And there are unit count limits to this. In New York City, in lower density areas, it's projects up to 250 units. And higher density areas, it's up to 500 units. And the way that higher density is defined is actually by height. So it's anywhere that would by right allow a project up to 45 feet. So that's considered the higher density areas in New York City. And these can be mixed use projects, but there's a limit on how much of the project could be commercial. It's up to 50,000 square feet in New York City, and up to 20% of the total square footage outside of New York City. And the unit thresholds outside of New York City are dependent on whether the parcel is in what the census calls an urban area. And so in these urban areas, if the parcel is in an urban area, you can build up to 300 units and qualify for the exemption. But if it's in a non-urban area, it's up to 100 units. And in certain parts of the state that don't have zoning, that's where it's the most limited, and it's up to 20 units. And importantly, this is based on the location of the parcel. So some jurisdictions, only maybe half of the jurisdiction are considered to be in an urban area. And so the parcel would need to be located in that portion of the jurisdiction. And there's some other exemptions in the bill beyond housing, public schools in New York City, certain water and sewage infrastructure, paths, and public parks. Next slide. So the definition of what is a previously disturbed site. It is a site that has been developed with another use at least 2 years before the application for the housing approval has been submitted. And that means there needs to be some sort of structure, maintained space, or otherwise improved. And there's a few other limitations on that. It can't be in a flood zone unless the municipality has adopted a specific building code ordinance that is for flood zones. And New York City is one such jurisdiction that has that kind of a building code. The site also has to be connected to existing water and sewer. And then in non-urban areas, the site has to be adjoined to other sites that are previously disturbed. And the point of that was just to make sure that, that it's in a developed area, in a developed context, and not just a disturbed site that is maybe otherwise surrounded by a green field. So this is a statewide map of urban areas. Um, you can see it's really not just limited to major cities. Anywhere that is fairly developed is technically considered an urban area, even in some of the rural parts of our state or small towns. And this is what the urban areas look like in Westchester. So you can see most of the county is technically an urban area. And a lot of these jurisdictions, like Ossining, for instance, the entire jurisdiction is an urban area. And then when you get a little further north, like the town of Yorktown, it's about half. So it's this area that's outlined in pink. And the other piece of the reforms is it created what's called a shot clock. So these are basically just time limits for how long a municipality has for each part of the environmental review. So this is the part that actually applies to projects that don't qualify for the exemption. So projects that are going to have to go through environmental review. So the scoping for the environmental impact statement, which is really the first step, it has to be completed in 1 year from the establishment of the lead agency. And then the environmental impact statement itself has to be complete within 2 years after the positive declaration.
Thank you so much, Kirsten and Tim, for that super helpful context. Now I'll ask a few questions to the panelists, and then just as a reminder, if you have questions for any of them, please enter those using the Q&A function through Zoom, and we'll try to get to those at the end of the session. So this question for Josh, the organizations participating today, Welcome Home Westchester, Regional Plan Association, and Open New York, are all part of a coalition called Unlock New York's Future, which was an integral advocate for SEQRA reform leading up to the changes. Can you discuss about how this coalition helped achieve that reform and the factors that made this possible leading up to it?
Sure. Yeah. And, it, it was a huge team effort. So really grateful and glad to be on a panel with some of the biggest supporters at Open New York and BRI and Welcome Home Westchester really, really made this possible. But I think, one of the most important factors, to start with that really shouldn't be ignored is that we're in a housing shortage. And that is contributing to out of control housing costs not just in New York City, but all across the state. And so RPA, we have done an analysis and found that we need roughly 800,000 units, new units across New York State over the next decade to address that shortage. And we know that with our current land use policies, both at the state and local level, it is really not going to be possible to achieve that goal. And so, people and organizations know that there is this problem, and I think are really looking for ways to solve this. And this is a very multi-layered issue. There are a lot of issues that contribute to the shortage, but we know that SEQRA has played a major barrier to building housing, particularly in suburban parts of the state. And so when the governor announced that she was going to be pursuing SEQRA reform, we were really excited and ready to activate our partners to form the Unlock New York's Future Coalition. And so on day one, we had very strong support from housing advocates like Open New York, RPA, BRI, Welcome Home Westchester, and many, many others. As well as, I think what was very special about this coalition is that it continued to grow both geographically and across issue areas. So along with the strong support in Westchester, we also saw very strong support from organizations on Long Island, including organizations like Association for a Better Long Island, the Long Island Association, and the Long Island Coalition for the Homeless. And also we saw support from upstate organizations, from organizations that, did fair housing work, organizations that are senior advocates, transit advocates, and we really were able to sort of expand the conversation to show that it's not just, the housing do-gooders that want to see this happen, there's actually a lot of interest across a broad issue area. And this coalition, I think, made it a lot easier to meet with legislators and demand and demonstrate all of that broad interest. And so, I think that we, as a coalition, did a very good job making a very positive case for SEQRA. And I think like we sort of made it seem like a no-brainer in the end. It was a very big issue in Albany this year, but it certainly wasn't the most controversial one. And I think like when we were able to actually have conversations with legislators, they were very policy-focused conversations, laying out like what SEQRA was, what it was designed to do, and how we can update it to make it easier to build infill housing. And I think when we were making that positive case with such a broad coalition, we really saw a big success.
Thank you so much, Josh. Going back to one of the points that you made there, what this all comes back to is something that everyone on this panel has recognized for some time, is that we do have a very severe housing shortage in Westchester. And that has been exacerbated by a number of factors. And just recently as last year, the US Census Bureau reported that Westchester is not only the fastest growing county throughout New York State, we are at the highest population ever to exist in Westchester. So why is this trend, this population trend, relevant to these ongoing discussions about the housing shortage, about reforms like SEQRA? Tim, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a good news, bad news sort of things. The good news is that there are more people who live in Westchester, want to live in Westchester, want to work in Westchester than ever before. Our last count was 1.1 million people, which is phenomenal. And in fact, we are the only county within the Hudson Valley region that has been gaining population. And of course, last year, the 1 year growth was greater than any other region in New York State, which is fantastic. But it does put pressure upon housing, and it's a simple question of supply and demand. We were already in a housing shortage before. The housing needs assessment that came out in Westchester County in 2019 found that we needed 11,703 new units of affordable housing that did not at that time exist just to meet what was then present day demand. Our best guess is that we're more in the range of 15,000 to 17,000, even with an increase in about a dozen communities in terms of building housing over that period of time, in no small part because the hole is so large and also because the population continues to grow. So it's pretty simple. When you have more demand for a product, in this case housing, and you have constrained supply, prices go up. And that's what we've been seeing all over the place. It's what we've been seeing for renters. It's what we've been seeing for homeowners. It's what we're seeing for millennials, for seniors who want to stay in place. It's what we're seeing for young professionals. We're seeing that the fastest shrinking demographic is those aged 30 to 45. Coincidentally, as a direct result, the second fastest shrinking demographic are those 18 or under, because the young families that have always been the renewing lifeblood of Westchester County are just not finding things within their price point. There is one bright spot in all of this. We do have one community where 1 year rents were relatively flat, only one. And then in this most past year, the rents actually declined by about 2%, and that's New Rochelle. Well, why is that the case in New Rochelle and not anywhere else in Westchester County? Because they've been growing in leaps and bounds in terms of the housing that they're able to produce at a volume that probably would not be sustainable in most other communities, but it shows that this is actually a fundamental economic question in terms of supply, demand, and prices, and one that we can address if we get out of our own way and are able to build the housing that we need more effectively. Now, again, SEQRA is not going to solve all of this in and of itself. Its impact is limited, and it's limited by design, and it's only focused on one part of the many parts that cause housing to be slowed down, delayed, stopped in some cases, or cut in half by various communities. And we need to work on all of that. But it certainly was a piece that was adding a lot of unnecessary time, dragging things down, and sometimes being used as a weapon to try and slow down or stop particular projects. And so the fact that we're moving forward on that is very, very good for us to actually address what is an escalating problem in terms of housing affordability.
Thank you, Tim. Um, Kirsten, SEQRA is a very decades old process, and it's something that a lot of communities here in Westchester are familiar with how it works. Why now? Why was this the time for the reforms to happen? And what does it mean for current development proposals, and those that are maybe coming in the near future?
Yeah, so why now? Well, one reason is I think we saw some other states, particularly on the West Coast, states that actually, I should say, so SEQRA was modeled after the West Coast environmental review laws, so California and Washington's laws. A lot of the language is almost exactly the same. But those states figured out a little before us that maybe these laws weren't perfect. Maybe they weren't actually tackling the environmental issues and climate change in the way that we thought they were. Um, so they kind of paved the way to kind of, I think, help make legislators here feel a little more comfortable with looking at our laws. But I think the other thing is just the pressure of the housing crisis. It has gotten so bad. And I think, legislators have seen the examples in their districts where these infill projects are being held up over things that just have nothing to do with the environment. Things like, parking is a big one, or like, oh, they didn't get the right traffic consultant. The local legislators didn't like the traffic consultant they chose, things like that. Um, and I think the other thing is realizing that this law was written 50 years ago. It was written before we even knew what climate change was or what was causing it. Um, and so we had our coalition had a lot of conversations with environmental groups and with legislators about, adapting these laws, how this exemption is a way to kind of adapt seeker to the climate change era, because we know that infill housing is one way to address climate change. And as
Thank
far
you.
as current projects, at least here in New York City, I've already heard about multiple affordable projects that had just been starting to do seeker, and now they're like, oh, well, we thought we were going to be spending at least a year on that, and now we're already moving on to the next part of the process, which has been great to hear.
Fantastic. And that's a great transition into our next topic, which is that SEQRA has always been a very important piece of legislation for the environmental movement. So, how did environmental groups approach the proposed changes to SEQRA, and what was the interaction like between the SEQRA Reform Coalition and the environmental advocates, Josh?
Yeah, it was such an interesting, and I think like, it feels very rare to say this in politics, but an actually like very thoughtful and open dialogue that we were able to have as housing advocates with our friends in environmental groups to really talk about like our different angles and interests and where they overlap, and also, kind of learn where we might depart. And so just sort of like from a level setting, perspective, secret is, a very, very important piece of legislation for the environmental movement and for us. Like I think secret has done a lot of very important, it has had a lot of very important impacts that have helped improve our environment. It like goes beyond just the housing space. It really involves any governmental action, and there are a lot of actions that could be causing environmental harm that should receive some scrutiny. But at the same time, I think a lot of environmental groups understood that good housing policy is good environmental policy. So housing policy that promotes dense infill housing is actually very good for the environment and vice versa. And, one of the issues that I think we were able to come together on is that, sprawling development of single family housing that sort of eats into our existing open spaces and forest land is actually something that we could control a little bit more and make it easier to be building within our already existing urban centers. And so, one example of that is RPA analyzed a forest land loss between 2001 and 2019. We actually found that the state lost 68,000 acres of forest land, and 94% of that forest loss was attributed to sprawl and development of single family homes on greenfield developments. And so, the environmental groups see this as a big issue, but and also, I think we're able to understand that SEQRA, making it more difficult to build infill housing, was contributing to that process. And so there was, an established understanding that there was a problem here, which I think makes it a lot easier to then start thinking about like what do solutions look like. And so, I think like all good coalition building, we were always very interested in listening first, really understanding like what some of the concerns were, also being able to talk about like, well, what are the proposed policies? Like, how do we see them actually being impacting the communities that people are concerned about, and then like thinking through, what those impacts are. And while we weren't always on the same page with every organization, I think there's a lot of diversity within the environmental movement and between environmental groups. But I think it's like fair to say that a vast majority of organizations that I met with, and I know that we all met with in our different capacities, understood that something needed to change, and were looking to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. And so think that recognition sort of moved us away from a place of opposition and helped us, I think, shy away from the narrative that like all environmental groups hate housing and all the housing groups just want to, build on the open space. There was like a lot of trust that we were able to build. And I think, like I said earlier, you might notice like SEQRA was not the most controversial thing up in Albany this year. And that wasn't necessarily a given. I think that was like in part because there was that trust and there was a lot of restraint on all of our sides to really try and understand each other and not actually, go and pick out a conflict.
Thank you, Josh. I think we have a lot of local officials with us today, so we're really thrilled to have you. And so I want to make sure that we're addressing really, Tim, what are the most important things for Westchester County local elected officials and land use board members to understand about these reforms? We talked about maintaining that local zoning control. So what are things that they should know to watch out for in the coming months as this is rolling out?
Well, although we think on net this is going to be very positive in terms of helping us address our housing supply and our housing shortage issues, there are some areas that are probably going to have to get worked out over the next couple of months that folks should be aware of, particularly if you are a decision maker. The first of which is that the law took effect essentially immediately upon signing by the governor. So some cases it takes place a couple of months afterwards or even up to a year afterwards. That's not the case for this. So if an application is currently within your queue, or if it has not yet been brought forward and is going to get brought forward next week or next month or a few months from now, and it qualifies for the exemption, then the SEQRA takes effect essentially immediately. We would anticipate, although it hasn't been confirmed, that at some point DEC will be issuing an update to its SEQRA handbook for municipalities, including with some guidance on how to answer some of the questions that unquestionably are going to come up for the first few applications within the queue, but which the legislation itself is a little bit vague on, particularly when it comes to determining that something is on previously disturbed land and determining that the communal water or that the communal sewer that is already on that land is adequate. There will certainly be some cases which will be gray areas. Those are things that the municipalities will have to sort of figure out on a case-by-case basis while we're waiting for some further guidance from DEC. So that's number one. Number two is there is a slight deviation from the way municipalities have been operating so far, particularly on making that previously disturbed land designation. So if it was famous original SEQRA, you would go through a process in which there are a lot of different governments who may have an interest in it, of one of them being declared lead agency for the purposes of SEQRA. So if the school board has an interest, the planning board has an interest, the library board has an interest, or what have you, but the town board wants to really be running the process, they would declare themselves to be lead agency. Well, if the project is exempt from SEQRA, there's not actually a lead agency for SEQRA. So what the legislation instead says is that a responsible agency will be the one making the determination on previously disturbed land. That's going to be very, very clear if the application is going for one government and one government alone. But if it is often the case in Westchester County, there are overlapping governments. There's going to be a little bit of a push and pull trying to figure out how to resolve those questions while we're waiting for regulation. So these are things that municipal leaders will definitely, hopefully, be leaning upon their attorney for that municipality to make the determination, as well as the perspectives of their land use boards. These are issues that I would personally recommend, if they come up, that they be flagged for DEC on an ongoing basis so that they can give you the proper guidance that you need.
Thank you so much, Tim. I see we already have a lot of questions in queue, so I want to go ahead and skip ahead to our Q&A. I do not anticipate we'll be able to get to every question that's come in today, but there will be ways to be in touch with the panel afterward. So I apologize if we can't get to your questions, but for the panelists, I'll leave these questions open-ended, and if whoever wants to jump in and try to give a somewhat brief answer, since we do have quite a few. We have a question from Viola from the WCA. She asked, for years, stakeholders have pointed to environmental review as a barrier to housing production. As these reforms move into implementation, what impact do you expect they will have on housing development across the region? And what does success look like over the next several years? So looking ahead a little bit, whoever wants to answer.
Well, I would say, based on the examples that we gave at the start, what the problem is, a lot of those problems, if these reforms had been enacted several years ago, would certainly have been much, much better, if not solved outright. In a number of those cases, there were no major environmental impacts that were found, but a lot of time was added into the production. And if partly what we're trying to deal with is addressing our supply issues, if all of a sudden it takes 2 years for something to go through the housing production, get its approvals, and start to get built, as opposed to 3, 4, 5 years, that's obviously going to help us bring more supply online faster. Again, in certain contexts, and particularly in downtowns and areas where things have already been built, where we know the impact is going to be relatively positive, particularly if it's medium to small size. I will say there is an ancillary benefit to all of this as well, which perhaps we have not emphasized, which is that a lot of modern building winds up being built much better than what's already there in terms of things that are actually helpful to the environment, in terms of stormwater, in terms of energy efficiency. Many of the projects that I cited for you had some type of clean energy component to them, and yet they were ironically being delayed by something that was supposed to be, in theory, helping the environment. So I think that's going to be an ancillary benefit as well that we'll see moving forward. You won't just get more housing, but you will actually get better housing.
And I just want to also jump in. One thing that I thought was so interesting about, doing all the work on SEQRA and talking with some developers is the acknowledgement that some developers won't even put in an application into certain towns because they feared the SEQRA process to begin with. They just thought it wasn't worth their time and effort to be doing that. And I think that having these exemptions for small and medium-sized developments opens up the geography a little bit more, and like really expands like what might be possible. And so maybe there will be more enterprising developers that go to municipalities that are not the usual suspects. And I think that's very positive for the region because both from an equity standpoint, but also just thinking about how we balance our population, there's a lot of infrastructure, particularly on the transit side, that we could be taking more advantage of, particularly in the suburbs. And I think that this makes it a little bit more possible to do that. So I think that's also a very exciting development.
Thank you both. We have a quick technical question from Jeff. Would the exclusions apply to properties that require a zoning change?
So it depends at what point the zoning change takes place, is the short answer. There are some cases where a municipality knows that a project is coming forward and may be proactively changing the zoning before the application is reviewed. At that point, when the application comes forward, it doesn't have to go through the zoning change because it already complies. And actually, the Galleria is itself something of a good example of that. Much more common, however, is there does need to be a zoning change before the application, or at least a zoning variance before the application can go through the process. The SEQRA exemption itself technically applies to the municipality if it wants to change the zoning. It doesn't really apply to a variance for the zoning. That's its own separate process. It's got its own checks and balances and its own procedure. This is the exemption only applies on the environmental review piece of it, not anything else to do with local review.
Yeah, and I would say just to clarify, it would still any discretionary action that previously triggered environmental review, so zoning variances, a subdivision, a zoning text amendment, financing programs for affordable housing that used to trigger seeker. The only change is that those actions no longer automatically trigger seeker. And so you'll still have to go through the local process for those decisions, whether that's site plan review or the zoning variance. But instead of having to do the environmental review and the site plan review and the zoning text amendment process, you don't have to do the seeker portion of it.
Great, thank you so much. There's also some questions related to the shot clock. I think it's sort of like a catchy term that has gotten a lot of attention. So are there restrictions on the shot clock provisions? Does it apply to only certain non-exempt housing projects or everything SEQRA applies to? And what happens if the shot clock time limitation occurs from the applicant point of view and versus the land use board's point of view?
I believe it applies to all non-exempt projects, but someone else can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, it should apply to all types of housing. What I'm not clear on is whether it applies to some of the other things that were changed at the same time, which were with regards to childcare, clean energy. There were a bunch of exemptions. Housing was obviously the thing that everybody was focused on, but there's some other really good things that are in there. Again, so long as they take place on previously disturbed land. I'm not clear if the shot clock specifically applies to that. There is so the shot clock, just to be clear, is one more time, is 1 year from the time a lead agency is declared until it determines if there needs to be a full environmental review, and then 2 years to complete that review. So we're talking a shot clock that's potentially 3 years. The municipality, if they are not getting information or complete information from the applicant, has an option to grant itself an extension even on the 2 years, but they have to document specifically what they haven't gotten from the developer. So it's supposed to foster some type of communication back and forth. But if they're truly getting the runaround, they do have a mechanism whereby they can grant themselves an extension at their sole discretion. So there are some checks and balances that are built into this. 3 years, just to be super clear, is a really long time. The Lot A SEQRA that we mentioned earlier took about 5 months. The Galleria project, which would not be exempt at all under this, is 3,000 units. That environmental review is actually complete within the city of White Plains, and that took less than a year. So if it takes less than a year to have a massive project involving 3,000 units, 3 years for a project that is, relatively small to medium sized ought to be more than sufficient if everyone's pulling through.
Thank you. And another question, has the state specified how this is going to be enforced? Are there repercussions if these timelines aren't met going forward?
That is one of the things that we're going to have to see. The most common way, so I mentioned the 2 lawsuits that went with Chappaqua Crossing. Just to be clear, those were not lawsuits from people within the community against the project, although in some contexts, things like that do happen to try and delay things. Those were the applicant suing the municipality for failing to complete SEQRA in a timely enough fashion and demonstrating that they had complied with all information requests. So if all else fails, that last thing still exists, and it exists with a more specific time frame. In the past, someone who was getting the runaround from a municipality who was just delay, asked for more information, asked for a second soil report, asked for a third soil report, up to the 5th soil report, which, by the way, all show that there was not an environmental impact. Their recourse was to do an Article 78 lawsuit. If someone fails to adhere to the timeline, it doesn't have a good excuse. I would expect that to be the enforcement mechanism still. There is not an outside enforcement mechanism beyond that.
Thank you, Tim. Also on the topic of Chapel Crossing, Deirdre's asking, would the litigation that delayed Chapel Crossing have been avoided if not for SEQRA, or would the opponents simply have found other grounds?
So in this case, as mentioned, the lawsuit was on the part of the applicant. I do think you will often see folks. Let me just put it this way: Article 78 proceedings from folks within the community finding that a particular secret declaration by the village was incorrect based on their own private studies of the impacts or other things that they think were taken into consideration are not uncommon. They tend not to be very successful simply by the fact that if the municipality and the developer are doing exactly what they say that they're doing and they're doing everything in good faith, the body of evidence that they will be able to bring to bear versus something that was Googled is probably going to carry the day within court. The biggest problem, as always, is the delay. There is a cost to delay. There is a cost, and if you had started building a project about 5 years ago, the interest rates on your financing alone are completely different than the interest rates you can get for that same project now, as everybody knows, because we've been paying attention to the economy. And there are many other things where all of a sudden you add delay and the circumstances of the cost increases, plus the process of going to court, plus the process of going through the municipality for repeated SEQRA events and having all your consultants pay during that may take something that was just barely on the cusp of being able to pencil out, no longer pencil out. And so that's much more the concern is that not necessarily that these Article 78 proceedings on the part of the community were likely to be successful. They typically were not, but they add so much extra time to the clock. And that delay can sometimes bring with it costs that makes the project not happen at all. That's been one of the many contributing factors is not so much that it took longer and who cares, it took a lot longer, it costs a lot more, and in some cases we didn't get the housing we needed as a result.
Thank you. Um, Lindsay asked, now that NIMBYs won't be able to use SEQRA to block new housing, what are some other anti-housing tactics that we should be alert to?
Well, so as mentioned, we're only talking about the environmental piece of it. We're not talking about anything that involves a zoning or a zoning variance. We're not talking about people coming forward and saying, this is too much too fast, and I would like to declare a village-wide or a town-wide or a city-wide moratorium. Whether those are good tactics or not, or reasonable or not, I expect that many of those are going to continue to happen. As was the case before, if you went through SEQRA and you were basically found to have no environmental impacts, sometimes you would have neighborhood defenders who would come up with their own set statistics to show that the municipality was wrong to have found that. I imagine that that fight will continue to happen, but that fight is going to be about whether it should have been declared exempt or not. Um, it's very, very clear, I think, in terms of what the finished product was that was produced in legislation, what qualifies as previously disturbed or not previously disturbed. But I would imagine some of that will be in dispute. And that's probably the next frontier that we will see.
And I know we are coming very, very close to time, but I actually think that this is a good time to plug everyone for actually getting involved because, like Tim was saying, this is not going to solve everything. Our housing shortage is caused by a multi-layer problem of policy that I think a lot of it comes down to who is advocating on the local and state level for policy changes that make it easier to build housing. And so I do just want to encourage everyone to get involved with any local housing advocacy groups nearby, whether that is Welcome Home Westchester or Open New York or doing your own research and advocacy because there is so much demand for housing and I cannot stress enough how important it is for people, especially people that are not necessarily affiliated or professionally doing advocacy to show up and support housing. So please, please, please get involved with any of your local advocacy organizations.
Thank you so much, Josh. I know we are at time now, so I'm going to, in my exit comments here, I just want to say thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us today. Thank you for all the wonderful questions. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all of them. I see a lot of fantastic questions still in queue. So I do want to invite you to stay engaged with all of our organizations. Feel free to reach out to any of us with those follow-up questions. And I will sneak one answer into John's question about government policies that beyond SEQRA that could help with the housing shortage. I would encourage you to check out the Welcome Home Westchester website and look at our policy agenda. We have 8 policy ideas that can be implemented at the local level related to the housing shortage here in Westchester County. And this session is also being recorded. We will have a full video for you to share out afterwards if you want to rewatch any part of this. And we encourage you to share that with your colleagues who couldn't be with us today as well. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you again to Kirsten, Tim, and Josh. Very much appreciated. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your evening.